I'm going to start with Jon Chesto, who is synonymous with Boston business news over the last 20 plus years. If you're not reading him, haven't seen him on local business TV or heard him on the radio, you're living under a rock. At the Boston Globe, his columns focus on companies and people shaping the Boston business landscape. We're all rightly concerned these days with customer and employee experience, and we have two experts in the research community on with us today. TJ Keitt is an expert on both customer and employee experience in his role as principal analyst at Forrester. TJ focuses on customer experience professionals. I spent personally many years working with TJ at Forrester, and he's as forthright an analyst as you'll find. Dom Nicastro is here from CMS Wire. Dom and I, interestingly enough, got off to a bit of a rocky start in our relationship. I was a PR guy trying to control release of some of our content, and Dom was just a dogged, good reporter doing his job. Of course, for those of you in the business, we know that occasionally PR and media have those type of conflicts that arise. Dom and I have a great relationship now, I think. And he has a lot of valuable insight as a former editor at a daily paper and a trade journalist. Like TJ, Melissa O'Brien is here from HFS, and she focuses on customer experience as well. She leads HFS's research initiatives for digital front office services, which includes customer engagement operations, digital marketing, and CX design and consulting. She is also very passionate about her dogs, and if we hit a lull today, I may ask her to share some pictures. So with that, I want to hop into some of the questions, and I'll be looking at the chat function within Zoom and also on Slido to make sure that we're answering your questions as well. But let's kick it off. John, maybe we can start with you. How has the job changed in the last 10 years?
Well, I'll get to it. I would say it's changed almost as much in the last 6 months as it's changed in the last 10 years because of circumstances. But so I'll get to that in a moment. The last 10 years, 10 years ago, reporters were just starting to get involved with social media in terms of how it affects their work and integrating. Primarily then it was Twitter. And of course now we're using Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram as well. So that was one major thing we had to think about that we didn't have to think about before. I would say over time, working into events like this have become much more important than they were back then. And I think that, generally speaking, for the Globe, we have sort of broadened our, as print ad revenue has gone down, we've brought it into events. Of course, those events are virtual right now, but so that has sort of changed the nature of the work a bit. Even 10 years ago, I don't think we were posting breaking news as much to get it online quickly and then follow up with in-depth analysis. And I feel like that's happening a lot more now than ever. And so that, sometimes when you've got a breaking story, you've just got to hammer it out and then and then sort of flesh it out later, which is a little different than the old days. I think some wire reporters, that was part of their job, was doing that. But I think for the rest of us, we have the luxury of a day. And now, of course, I get the common question, are you on deadline, when someone's pitching to me? And I always feel a little sheepish or maybe snarky saying it, but I'm always on deadline. There's always something I've got to file. I've got an edit back. I've got to return it, in a matter of minutes because it's got to get posted. There's always some, photo assignment that has to be in, or graphic assignment that has to be in at a certain time of day. So the day is like, there's really no lulls to the day anymore. That's for sure. And of course, in the last 6 months now, we're all working virtual, which has sort of changed how we meet with sources. I've had very few in person. Of course, they've been out of doors meetings with sources. I'd like to start doing more now before it gets too cold. But it's much more phone calls and Zoom calls like this. And I will say it's a much more challenging, just because the give and take of information is a little bit, people are a little bit more free flowing when you're sitting next to them than when you're staring at them on a screen or talking to them on the phone. That probably has been the bigger change. And I would say just the fact that now covering the pandemic and also the issues of racial inequity are two dominating storylines that sometimes intersect, but certainly are overarching themes that affect almost all our coverage of the globe. So to have something like that, I mean, I remember the Great Recession was loomed very large in my reporting during that time. But even that seems secondary to the two issues of the day right now. So having kind of these two dominating storylines has also been a big change.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd love to follow on with that, and I want to get to the rest of the panel on that in a moment. But as someone who works with journalists every day, particularly at publications and dailies like the Globe and the New York Times and places like that, how much of what is happening in our society start to intersect with even what you have to think about as a business reporter writing about the landscape here in Boston?
Well, I mean, certainly the stories that I have to think about what I'm going to write. Generally, editors want stories that affect or are somehow connected to one of those two themes. So it has to be a pretty high bar of a story that has almost no relevance to either of those themes to get picked up by an editor right now. And so that's different, a big difference from before. And, hopefully these are two huge issues that hopefully that we can get some resolution to over the next 6 months, and maybe that will change. But right now it's, we're a long way from quote going back to normal, if we ever really go back to normal.
Yeah. So I think you've already provided a little bit of guidance there, right? Which is, as you think about trying to get coverage from the Globe or a big daily, you really need to think about how your story rises above all of the noise that really is out there right now, and also ties to something bigger. Particularly when looking at folks that are in the business media. That's a great point, John, and happy that we made that early on, because I know that's something that I'm dealing with on a regular basis. I have clients that come to me and say, "Hey, we want to be in the New York Times," and boy, that's a tough nut to crack. And I have a lot of friends over the Times, and it's hard right now unless your story really is connecting to something bigger, something larger that's happening in the world around us. TJ and Melissa, I would love to hear your thoughts on how the job has evolved over the last few years. Having worked at an analyst firm myself, I know that there's always discussions around content and content creation and the content that really resonates this day and age. I'd just love to hear a little bit more from the Forrester side, from HFS, in terms of how over the last few years things have changed in your worlds.
Well, I mean, I think you have to take it from the perspective of what happened outside of those companies, outside of a Forrester or an HFS. I think what you have to say is, number one, it's a lot easier for people to start companies these days, which means that there are more companies that show up every once in a while and want to talk to you about the things that they're doing. As a consequence of that, there are more things for you to track, especially in emergent parts of the market. So a few years ago when file synchronization was a hot topic, you had companies like Dropbox or Box, but then there were dozens of others that also were leveraging, freely available cloud infrastructure to create similar sorts of services that could synchronize files across a bunch of different documents. And so the question, becomes, why so much redundancy in the market? How many different ways can you slice this particular sort of offering, create different industry perspectives, different company size perspectives, and so on in order to deliver value. And so, I think just the volume of companies that have been created and want to talk about what they're doing has made it in many ways difficult to track what's emergent, what's important. Particularly if you kind of take like a wait and see approach to most of these things, where you're saying, well, let's just see if any of these things catch on, and usually using your own customer base as an indication of that, given that within my business, we're not trying to I guess talk to a mass market. We're talking primarily to people who sign up for our services. So that usually has a profile. The companies that we're talking to usually have a profile, which means that when you're sifting through all these companies that are emerging, you're looking for companies that you kind of fit the bill for. Take your pick. So Forrester's talking to primarily companies 500 million and above, 1 billion and above, and so the threshold for what they're interested in and what they feel comfortable trying to employ as enterprise-wide solutions may differ from a company that is smaller in size, scale, and so on. And so that I think, at least in terms of the big thing that would probably be relevant to this group is just kind of understanding that there are far more companies that are emerging that do similar sorts of things and that have money to spend because capital, for the past few years has been relatively easy to get. So it's easy to do an angel round. It's easy to do a Series A, because people want to park their money someplace. And so, just kind of recognizing that, from someone in my chair, it's, there are a lot of things that we're kind of balancing when we're looking at, the number of companies that are showing up, in terms of, filtering it through what's relevant to our clients, what would they be comfortable with, what proof points do they need, that this is a thing that has any sort of staying power, which then becomes important for anybody that's trying to talk to us about this to kind of recognize that, we're not, here just kind of listening to pitches from, any company that decides to show up. There is a rhyme or a reason to, what it is that we're looking to understand.
Yeah, I'll chime in there too, TJ. I absolutely agree that the volume is just so much higher, from when I started in the analyst world about 10 years ago. So I've had the perspective of working for one of the, larger technology research firms, 56-year-old IDC for 5 years before I joined HFS and have been here for 5 years. And one of the biggest things on top of the volume that's made our jobs even more challenging is I think everything's a lot less well-defined now. There's so much convergence and overlap in many technologies. You've got products firms that are, turning to services models. There's so much change that's happened and disruption, and particularly in the last year, in the last few months or so. And that's our job, to get to the bottom of it and to distill it, right? So that's become a challenge, but also a really, really interesting thing to do, to talk to all these different firms that, are coming at some of the same problems with different solutions. And another thing I'd add is just how information is getting spread, how we're communicating with people. And I think, Jon spoke to that with, just talking about the platforms, that you're now operating on. And HFS is one of the smaller, more disruptive analyst firms. When we started, about 10 years ago, and one of the biggest platforms for us was social, because, being a smaller firm and wanting to get your stuff and your name out there, so we've just amassed a really big presence on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and that's how we actually get a lot of engagement going. And so I think that's only accelerated now in the virtual world. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I got so many more LinkedIn messages now. And it is a bit overwhelming, but it's also really great, because it's great to, have these other avenues for folks to reach out to consume our research and some of our thought, our thought leadership. So yeah, like I said, it's an interesting but fun challenge.
Yeah, social media certainly changed the game. I don't want to overlook, Dom. I don't want to overlook you on this question too, because in the trade world, things have changed dramatically too over the last few years. And Jon talked specifically too about the last 6 months, and I know just from my history in this business, any sort of economic downturn certainly has serious implications for the trade world. So I'd love for you to talk to the audience a little bit about how things have changed and what people might not understand about the day-to-day and what you're looking for to help differentiate one company from another.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on the panel, by the way, and hello, everybody. It's, when COVID struck, like February, March, the disruptions were crazy, but we cover customer experience strategies, technology, best practices, but also employee experience, digital workplace. And we had to remember in our coverage that remote work did happen before COVID, right? We couldn't really say this was the first time that people have been remotely working. So we couldn't use kind of COVID as this big excuse to write these, wow, remote work, this is how you do it. This is how you're gonna have to, adjust. But at the same time, we wanted to be mindful of the fact that organizations were making this huge, huge change. In fact, I talked to one of the big goals for me, and I'll just kind of probably skip ahead to a question you were gonna ask later, Phil, is to get practitioners to talk to me about their challenges and their day-to-day life. The vendors are front and center and they have a huge role, but to get the people who are using the technology is huge. And I talked to one practitioner for a story about when COVID happened. He worked in IT for a huge international bank. And imagine moving 85% of your workforce that was in an office to remote. They didn't have laptops. They didn't know if they had internet. They knew nothing. So this was the biggest scramble of their life, so the biggest pivot. So, my goal as a journalist was to kind of capture those stories and bring those to life to say, hey, we're struggling with that too. Maybe we could get a tip or two from this article. But yeah, it was, my job, we wanted to have our coverage just recognize the fact that, yes, there were some major changes, but this definitely happened before.
Yeah, that's helpful. We've talked a little bit about the consumption of content, which I think is great. We've covered that. In terms of, we've got hopefully a lot of people here that are thinking about how they want to engage with you and they want to get it off. They want to get that relationship off on the right footing. What are maybe some of the biggest misconceptions that companies have about working with you? You've all been around for a bit here. You've had some experiences. What do you find works for people that are looking to make sort of that initial intro with you? And on the flip side of it, what doesn't work? Because we all know that we've had those experiences as well.
That we're all cranky. That's the biggest misconception. All journalists are cranky. Nope, open book, welcome. Got something to pitch, let me know. I won't always say yes. I think a lot of PR folks, Phil, and a lot of tech startup people might be, they seem like they're, do you mind if I send you a study? Like, just send it. I don't have inbox arrogance. We're all friends. We're all, as much as PR might be afraid to, upset a journalist, I need them too. I need PR too. My inbox is a great source of material that I can, if I might say no to a pitch today, but 6 months later, I might say yes, because now that customer experience expert is needed for one of my stories. It's like, when do I need you? Not right now, but maybe in 2 years, I might go back. So my advice is, or the misconception that people have is everyone's cranky. And you have to be afraid to approach and delicate. This journalist is going to be mad at me. I'd say go for it.
Yeah.
Well, Don makes a good point, though. He's referring to his email inbox, which is the way to go versus the phone inbox. I still have some messages back at my desk. I haven't been in my office since March, and I occasionally check in and see what they're saying. And I get most of the messages, but I can't get them all. But even when things are normal and my phone's ringing off the hook, I can't answer the phone all the time. It's much quicker for me to respond to by email. You can kind of do that more politely in off hours than you can with returning a phone call. And plus, it's for journalists at least. The email pitch is much better than the phone pitch because it allows you to sort of catalog it. As Dom said, sometimes maybe that what seems like news to you isn't quite what we're looking for now, but it might fit into a story, maybe a trend story, or that we're working on down the line. And so I can sock it away. Also, sometimes I'm not the right person, or I'm busy, and I can forward that on to someone else. Much harder to do with a phone pitch. So I still get phone pitches, even though I'm not even in the office. They still come after me, and on my cell. And if it's an urgent story and you want to make sure, like, I got it because it's going to go out to the world, and you want me to have it first, then by all means try me on the phone. But that's got to be the kind of only for the most extreme examples. Email is much more handy.
Yeah, I was going to add on, John, to what you just said there. I had a pitch that I had sent out probably 6 weeks ago now, and had the reporter reach back out yesterday and want to jump on the phone, right? And I have found, and I have been doing this for a few years, right, that reporters do keep things, right? There's a folder where things go, or it's kept in the inbox of 8 bazillion emails, but they will remember, right? Oh, right, I remember that company reached out to me. This is a good time for me to talk about. In this case, it was ServiceNow. So I think that's a great point. The other thing I wanted to add about the phone, I would say always start with email. And I would say, I have managed teams where I always encourage people, if they had not heard back from someone they had a relationship with, give them a call. Just get on the phone. And they'll say yes, they'll say no, but then we're done. And I find that there's a fear sometimes, especially with people just breaking in, to pick up the phone, maybe because of what Dom talked about before, which is all reporters, all analysts are cranky. But the reality is, you may very well get a nice, quick response, and it might be a positive one. But I would say there are instances, pick up the phone, but, also to John's point, remember, we heard what a day looks like. These folks are cranking. They are cranking on writing content, interviewing people. Pick up the phone as sort of the last resort. TJ and Melissa, in terms of misconceptions with analysts, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so it's probably a little bit different on the analyst side. I'm not sure how other firms do it exactly, but we do have a little form on our website. If you fill it out, then it goes directly to our operations team. And then there's a couple of small hoops to jump through, but it's not terribly difficult. And it's mostly for your benefit, because it makes sure that there are the right analysts getting lined up to speak to you. And also to understand, of course, if there's potential for your firm to, become a consumer of some of our services. If you've looked at our research, how much you know about us, all that good stuff. So it gives a good sense of actually prep for you before you end up on the briefing. But yeah, I mean, same really as these guys said, we're always all ears. It's our job to be finding interesting companies, and we love to hear from them. And I'm actually not that cranky, Phil, believe it or not. Sometimes.
That's great. And actually, you hit on something I would love to cover there. And I see some questions starting to come in that I think start to cover this. One of them here, what's the bare minimum you expect from a startup that reaches out? Do you care about companies that are in pre-product launch, or only companies with customers or VC funding? And I find, obviously, I think that's a question that is going to be on the minds of a lot of folks in this audience. What I have found, and I'm really interested to hear from you guys on this, is that by and large, reporters, analysts are very open to hearing from startups. But what I'd love to hear from you guys is, what are the elements that are going to help a startup really start to engage with you as a reporter and or an analyst?
Well, I can start. The big, I guess, milestones that startups like to broadcast are their funding rounds. But to be honest, the funding rounds, to the average reader, sort of all look the same. $5 million is a ton of money to our average reader versus 50 million. And so it's just it's hard to differentiate, even though I know this is one of the biggest things in a startup's life. I've got to look for some sort of interesting hook. Maybe it's a new CEO. Maybe it's we're going to hire X number of people in Boston. with this funding round. Maybe it's a really clever way of solving a problem that other companies haven't thought of yet. So it's the pitches from startups can't just be sort of, oh, here's our funding round, because at least I would say for general interest media, it's really not enough. You've got to think about like what the average person at home want to read about. What sort of makes your funding round more interesting than the next person's, because there are tons that we don't cover at all. So you've got to make a good pitch for why we should write about yours versus the 5 others that we're hearing about this week.
Yeah. TJ, Melissa, what about hearing from startups? TJ, obviously you and I spent quite a few years together at Forrester, and I know what the client profile looks like. That said, I work with startups now, and I talk to Forrester analysts, every couple of weeks, right? So I do think there's a misconception that if, we're a small startup, particularly maybe the big firms, Forrester, Gartner, IDC, they don't care about us. Do you have some thoughts or insights on that in terms of how you think about startups that approach you for briefings?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to vary by analyst and by coverage area. But I mean, I think the thing to remember, at least for me anyway, is we're not journalists, so, we're not here to try to generate a story that is going to go into a paper or a magazine or on television. We are conduits of information to our clients. And I guess to do that, we're also pattern recognition machines. So we're basically looking for things that seem like they're parts of trends. So startups are interesting insofar as they speak to something that's happening in the marketplace that requires this sort of service to exist. And so I mean, there are things that that would be interesting as indicators of that. So it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to show up without a product or customers, because that doesn't indicate that there's a lot that your product has proven in the marketplace, either as like a part of a market or as the vanguard of an emerging market. Funding rounds are interesting, but only insofar as they indicate that that investors are starting to take note of it. Client wins are interesting, but only insofar as they indicate that companies of increasing size become interested in using your product or service. So I think it's when you're I guess reaching out to maybe one of the larger analyst firms, kind of keep in mind that the reason why someone would be interested in speaking with you is because they're trying to sort out whether or not what it is that you do aligns with some sort of trend that they've been tracking, or something that is potentially interesting to the set of customers that they hold a portfolio for.
Yeah, absolutely. I would add to that, I would say that the bare minimum is definitely have some clients and some client stories, because otherwise it's not going to be relevant for our research coverage. Less concerned about funding and things of that nature. We are really concerned with how the product or service fits into the trends that we're following. So having some preparation as far as, even looking at our stuff, we have a lot of stuff that's in front of the paywall at HFS where we've got data and thought leadership where you can, take a peek. I mean, you don't have to study it, but just be like, oh, this is going to be interesting to them because, and then come prepared. The briefing, and we're not stuffy or super formal about our briefings by any means, but, come with some kind of concise story to tell, because there have been too many that, where you get set up and the person's kind of like, okay, what do you want to know? And it's like, so just have some form of structure. It doesn't have to be a snazzy, sexy PowerPoint deck or anything like that. Some of the best briefings are even just discussions, but do come prepared with something that is an angle for, why we think this is interesting.
I think just one other thing I would say to piggyback on that. In a briefing setting, just keep the superlatives about yourself to a minimum. Odds are you aren't the only one. You aren't the only one capable. You aren't the the latest, you're probably the latest one that we've heard make that claim. If you've been doing this long enough and you've been covering a space, a particular part of the market long enough, you probably can give that person's pitch for them, especially if they're superlative heavy. So just kind of get to the point. It's not that we're being cranky about it. It's just that, usually these things these briefings don't last very long. They may be 30 minutes, they may be 60. So the quicker that you can get to the heart of, what it is that you want to tell us, and, less about the setup. Like, I know what the market is, so I don't need you quoting, stats back to me about like kind of the market. Just tell me what it is that you guys do and how you make a difference.
I'd say all that is also good advice for approaching the media as well. I think there's a lot of insight there to be gleaned when making just us.
Yeah. Get rid of paragraph 2, Phil. Get rid of paragraph 2. Paragraph 2 in press releases are the most wasteful words of all time. You always get that, all right, we've startup, this is our business. But in paragraph 2, they say, marketers are struggling with, according to a survey. Like, John, how many times you just go from paragraph 1 to 3? You're just like, no. I
usually go from paragraph 1 to 9 because you got all the quotes that you got to weed through.
Right.
Oh, that you're not going to quote. All these people you're not going to quote.
We've learned that reporters and analysts are not by nature cranky, but that we as PR people, marketers, can make them cranky by not, one, having a real story, and two, talking in superlatives that, most reporters and analysts don't need at this point in their careers. So I think that's something to really think about is, as you're sitting down and you're crafting a note to any of the folks on our panel, get rid of the marketing speak. It's just not valuable, right? So I think that's great advice from all of you. In terms of this one, I like, and I've probably been there over 1 million times. But what do you recommend for small startups if they don't get a response from an email? And I'm gonna hazard a guess that it's not continue to blow up their email with 10, 15, 20, 50 more emails. But I would certainly love your thoughts on that.
Well, I can speak for me at the Globe, and of course, each reporter has their own preferences. I usually don't mind a follow-up email. In fact, I'll find that sometimes I'll have accidentally deleted the email that I wish I hadn't, or it will have not ever got to me because of filter reasons. So a follow-up email is always welcome. I think for me, I don't mind phone for a follow-up, but I mean, time is of the essence, and I would say calling my cell really only if it's if you really deem it to be urgent. I do get pinged a lot on Twitter and LinkedIn with regard to pitches, but for the sake of that, it's difficult to respond to them. We respond to phone pitches. I prefer email because you've kind of got it all there in a package that you can forward onto and that you can save. So you can see me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and I know I'll probably see it and I can respond. But putting the pitches there is probably not a good place. But if you want to follow up, that's a place to go.
I can add to that about sending follow-up emails. One thing is not to do is don't put in the subject line "second attempt." Right? I've seen that. I've seen they literally put that in the email. I mean, in the subject line. But I will say, us journalists have this sort of like moi, like when someone shares our story, we get a little excited, like, really? You liked it? So if you're having bad luck and email with us, go on LinkedIn on a story I shared and comment on it. Try to build some kind of rapport. Share one of my stories, like, again, moi, you like my story? And, we'll remember your name. Like, oh, Sam Smith, he likes what I do. And then suddenly Sam Smith 3 weeks later emails like, hey, I read your story. It was pretty cool. When you get a sec, we got a pretty cool startup that I wanted to maybe get on your radar if you have a minute. So it's like building that rapport socially. You have all these channels. Why not try it?
Yeah.
I guess.
I was going to say with the analyst community, with the analysts, it's probably things like briefing requests, right? That you get and maybe you see it and you go, that one's not for me. Does that mean none of the briefing requests you get from that company or organization are for you, or is it just that one, right? I think that's the other thing here. It's not just simply they didn't respond to my pitch, but do I continue to pitch them? And I have thoughts on that, but I'm certainly interested in what TJ, Melissa, you have to say in terms of what most frequently comes across to you guys, which is I would imagine, if we're looking at this audience, briefing requests.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing personal. I'm not necessarily focused on that. I think the most dangerous thing to do is to kind of go to our bios, do a quick scan for a keyword, and then make the briefing request based on the keyword that you read in someone's bio. Just because I cover customer success doesn't mean or customer experience doesn't mean that I'm interested in your add-on to a CRM system. And that's not what I cover. And so, kind of understanding, how we talk about the world and the things that are under the umbrella that we cover is just as important as understanding the keyword that goes along, with our name. So I think I think if you're not getting the hook, that you wanted, with a briefing request, it might be cause to kind of reconsider, the people that you're telling the firm that you're trying to target, and thinking, I guess more generally about, other terms that, that may be important or kind of markets that people are covering.
Yeah, I don't get a lot directly, or if I do, I just point them to the process because it is actually really well managed by our operations team, where they're able to kind of qualify the company that's trying to speak with us and understand what they do, at least at a high level, and then figure out which analysts need to be on the call. Because otherwise, if we had to schedule all our briefings, our calendars are just so unwieldy, like I'm sure everyone else's on this call is. So it would be very difficult to manage that on an ad hoc basis. So, we do have this kind of tool in place, which is a funnel for, getting the right companies and the right people to talk to the right analysts. And it works. It actually works really well for us.
That's great. I feel like you've all hit on this a little bit, and I don't want to sit here and provide soft advice on how to build relationships, but there's been facets of that in things that each one of you has said. And TJ, I think you hit on it do some research, right? Are there particular ways to approach you as individuals, understanding that you're humans that are busy and you have a lot of things in the course of your day that take up time, that work specifically with you, right? And I would go back, having done this for a long time, and say research is critical. Understand what, from an analyst perspective, what TJ and what Melissa cover. Understand, what the business reporters at the Globe are covering. John's not the only business reporter at the Globe. What is Janelle Nanos covering? What are other reporters covering over there, right? When it comes to Dom, there's other people that are writing at CMS Wire. But as we kind of take a step back and think about, and this comes up in a couple of the other questions here, approach. How do startups, how does anyone really start to build a relationship with you, and what do they need to understand about that? I'll say that my approach has always been that I'm not approaching a reporter specifically for a piece of coverage, right? That is an output that ultimately I want, right? But there's a road to get there. Can you guys, can any of you add to that? Dom, any thoughts on, on how to best build a relationship? And I mentioned in the intro, you and I, certainly, I don't want to say butted heads, but certainly had some, some pretty open dialogue early on in our engagements together. But we've worked together extensively since, and I understand where you're coming from, and I think you understand where I am. So anything else you can add in terms of, how to build a strong relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the best things I've ever heard from a PR professional was, it was a one-line email to me, and she said, "Can I help you with any of your stories?" Right? There was no pitch. And I think it was at a really good time where I'm like, man, I'm short a couple sources here and there. Hey, you got anybody in employee experience that's an expert working on the transition from, IT becoming more of a service, employee experience versus just raw services? So that to me was like, wow, this person is offering me a way to boost my stories, not a way to boost her client. At the end of the day, guess what? It was a way to boost her client. So if I'm a startup coming into the world, it's like, hey, journalists, we're in your space. What can we do to help you? No, you're not going to get a profile on the company, but you might get the CEO a quick snippet, a quick quote in an upcoming article. So I would start there with, thinking of it from a less sort of selfish view and just say, hey, journalist, what can I do for you?
Yeah, I'll add to that, maybe going a little bit further down the pipeline, sort of once you've had the briefing or during the briefing and post the briefing, as you continue and want to, develop the relationship further. One of the things that we really appreciate in the briefing is to share with us your client stories, your case studies, and what the impact you've had with your customers. And even going further, if you want to introduce us to some of your customers so that we can speak to them directly, just remember, thinking of it through our lens. We're researchers, so we need to do our due diligence. We won't write up a company unless we have spoken with customers and fully understand and can vouch for, the things. So we have what we call a hot vendors program, for example, where that's the whole purpose of it. What interesting smaller startups are out there, and why should companies look at them, either from an acquisition standpoint or from a customer standpoint. And we have to speak to several of their customers in order to understand and make sure that we are doing our due diligence. So that's just huge. Companies that come to us and say, absolutely, here are a couple of our customers, they're more than willing to speak to you. That goes such a long way with analysts, for me at least personally, and being willing to share those stories with us also.
That's I think that's a great point. In terms of what you see, TJ and Melissa, from companies that come to you, brief you, do the majority offer customers, or is that something that's often overlooked?
The smaller ones, no, that's. I mean, they'll show a slide that has a bunch of logos on it. Here's a pro tip on that. We know that trick. You have a lot of customers because a lot of big companies try a lot of things, but those aren't actually customers in the sense that, say larger companies have enterprise level customers. So, when you're presenting those sorts of slides, just understand that we recognize that, hey, I've seen all these logos in everybody else's slides because these companies just try things out a lot. And so that's not indicative of your success in the market per se. It's kind of indicative of the fact that you've reached a point where someone wants to try you out, in a department or on a team. But I guess, to your main question about your relationship building, I guess the big thing, and I always come back to the fact that the reason why our job exists is because we're trying to help our clients identify things that are happening or that will happen. Is that the best way to kind of keep the dialogue going on my end is to tell me something I didn't know, to bring an angle to the conversation that that we hadn't looked at or considered. I've got colleagues that have built coverage areas on an insight that they first gained through a briefing with a newer company that was in an emerging space. So kind of, if you truly do believe that you kind of are on the cutting edge of something, then let's have that conversation and bring insights that verify that, as opposed to what we talked about earlier, which are just kind of superlatives that don't necessarily get your point across.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think the customer piece. I want to go back to that too, because I'm sure that that is certainly something that Dom and Jon want to hear as well. One thing to think about, certainly with the analyst firms, is that you might be able to set up a customer to talk even just on background about your company and how your company is enabling them to do something different, right? So that's one thing to consider. I would say early on, and a lot of you are coming from probably early stage companies, build it into your sales process, that you are going to ask your customer, you're going to have these asks for customers, right? It may be a blog post, it may be a webinar, it might be that they do a video, and it may be that they're going to serve as a reference customer for Forrester, for Gartner, for HFS, that they're going to be open to talking and sharing their stories with Jon or Dom, right? Get it and bake it into your organization early on, because you're going to need those things down the road. And it's hard after the fact to start to scramble and say, will you talk to the press? Well, it's the first time you're bringing it to me, and I don't know that I want to share my story with the globe. Right. So just think about it early on. How do you start to bake thought leadership, influencer relations into your relationships with your customers really early on? This has been great. I think we're pretty close to winding down now. I think I've captured all of the questions here. If I could ask you guys to just maybe provide one last piece of advice for the folks that are here, that are joining us, knowing that they're startups, what would you what haven't we said that you would advise?
I can start. For journalists, people like to read about people. Who in your company is fascinating? Who's got a backstory? Who's got some innovation chops? Who did something? I like to be connected to people, not companies. So find the people in your organization, make them stand out. Make those people be your best PR ambassadors. I'm going to mention. I'll part with this last thought. There's a CMO in the Boston area named Tom Wentworth. All right, he's a CMO of a company called Recorded Future. I have no idea what Recorded Future does, because I don't listen to that. But he is such a good personal ambassador of his own brand that he's always putting up thoughtful LinkedIn posts that 1 million people comment on. It gives me great story ideas. And I go back to Tom once every few quarters. And that little Recorded Future link, when I interview him and quote him, that's good PR. So my last piece of advice is, be champions for the people in your company, not just your product.
Yeah, Tom is very good at that. He's someone definitely to check out on LinkedIn.
My biggest piece of advice is to keep it simple. Keep it simple and straightforward, and focus on the why. This is so much more important nowadays than ever. Why does your company exist? What problem are you solving for your customers? And why is this important to the market? And if you can get to those points in a first briefing, then chances are that's something interesting that we'll continue to watch.
Great. Jon, TJ?
Hard for me to really top this. Good advice. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. I think it really boils down to providing like actionable information as opposed to marketing speak in the pitches, and like you said, building rapport when the pressure of presenting something or an embargo is not upon us. I mean, you really do have it's just human nature that if you can build a relationship with someone, you're going to be more predisposed, maybe not to cover their company in the pitches particularly, but predisposed to turn to them when there's a story that they might fit into. So to keep that in mind and I guess not be dissuaded, we get, I don't know, I get at least 100 pitches a day. It's the odds of a certain pitch getting through are slim, but I'm always looking to build relationships. So even in this, it's a lot more rewarding and I would say maybe a little more time consuming, but easier person to person in normal non-COVID times, but you can still build relationships even if you can't meet face to face.
I guess the only thing I could add is don't fixate on one particular analyst at a company.
That's good.
You don't really you probably don't know the organization well enough to determine whether or not the person that you have zeroed in on is the only person who may be interested in what it is that you're doing, which is why it argues for you to go more through the formal briefing process that a given analyst firm has, as opposed to trying to go directly to an analyst, because your odds of getting somebody who actually covers what you're doing and maybe have the time or interest in kind of looking at what it is that you have to say increases if you let those people that know their company best do the routing than you trying to do that independently.
Yeah, that's great advice, especially especially with one of the big analyst firms like Forrester Gartner, where you've got upwards of 200, 300 analysts. TJ, that's a great takeaway, I think, for people. I've got another takeaway, which is get Jon out for coffee before it gets too cold. But I want to thank you all for coming out and participating in this. It's always great to sit down with people that are super smart about engagement and how to engage with people in their professions, right? I mean, reporters and analysts are just like you and me, have a story, have a point, don't waste their time. They're not cranky. These are a lot of the takeaways that I have today.